Hashem, today's daf yomi is Shevuos daf yotes, Shevuos 19. Today's daf yomi is dedicated for Shemir for the Chayalim, that's all for the Shvuyim and Yeshua for Am Yisrael. This is Tzara, and we're going to start on the bottom of 18b, two lines above where the lines get wide. That it said in our Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer had said that if you touched a sheret and you forgot about it, then and then you enter the temple, you're liable for forgetting about the sherets, but you're not liable for if you forgot that this was the mikdash that you walked into. Whereas Rabbi Akiva says, "Al helam tuma you're liable, but not for helam mikdash," which sounds like the same thing. So what's the difference between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva? My benayo, what's the distinction between them? Amar Chizkiah sheretz v'nevela ika benayo. Do you have to know what exactly you touched? Do you need to know if you touched the sheret, which is like a creepy crawler creature, or you touched an veil? Do you need to know how you became tamei or not? From Eliezer's other position, savar ba'inon adi yada even sheret it may even a veil it may. From Eliezer's other position, that you need to know: did you become tamei from the sherets or from the carcass? And if you don't know what you became tamei for, then you will not bring the korban all the ored. Whereas Rabbi Akiva savar lo ba'inan adi yada. You don't need to know specifically which item may you become tamei. The kivan the yada the itma ba'olam motzarech ibisheretz itme even availed. Because once you know, since you know that you became tamei in general in the morning, Jeff, then you don't need to know specifically if it was tamei from a sheretz or from an avela. We're on 18b, the second wide line. Let me just review it for our friend Jeff, whose arrival is now. Basically, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva both say in the Mishnah that you're liable for helam tumah, but not helam mikdash. You're liable to bring korban all the yored if you forgot that this item was tamei. If you forgot you became tamei, but not if you forgot that you entered the temple. Not if you didn't realize this was a temple. Mara, from the Mishnah, it seems like Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva are saying the same opinion. So what's the difference between them? So the Gemara suggests here, Chizkiah suggests that Rabbi Eliezer says you need to know you're only liable to bring a korban if you know exactly how you became tamei. If you became tamei through a sheretz or an avela. But Rabbi Akiva says it doesn't matter if you know exactly how you became tamei, as long as you know you're tamei. So you don't need to know if you became tamei through a sheretz or an avela. An avela is a carcass, a sheretz is a creepy, crawly creature. So too Ua, the third wide line says, sheretz v'nevela ika v'nayo. And that's a distinction between them. And Ua arrived at this position by raising a contradiction within Rabbi Eliezer. Do Ua Rami, Rabbi Eliezer at the Rabbi Eliezer and Mashani. Ua threw two positions of Rabbi Eliezer against each other, and he answered them. He says, Me, I'm a Rabbi Eliezer, but Inan. Adi Yada, Iba Sheretz Itme, even Nevela Itme. He says, does Rabbi Eliezer really require and you know exactly how you became tamei, whether it's within a sheretz or nevela. But we have a contradictory brayso that Amar Rabbi that when it comes to in the Gemara Krisus, when we talk about how you bring a chatos, you bring a chatos if you violate one of the 36 prohibitions that if you do it intentionally you get kares. But let's say you're not sure which item you did. You ate a piece of meat which is not kosher and you get kares, but you're not sure if it was chelev or noser. They're both prohibited and they're both kares. So Rabbi Eliezer says, Monavshach, chelev achol chayim, noser achol chayim. It doesn't matter. You're going to have to bring a sin offering either way, or Shabbos chilo chayev, Yom Kippurim chilo chayev. Or it doesn't matter. You're not sure if you violated Shabbos or Yom Kippur. Or Ishto nida bal chayev achoso bal chayev. You're not sure if you're with your sister or with your wife when she's in nida. Either way, you're going to have to bring the chatas. So Rabbi Eliezer there says you don't need to know exactly what you sinned, whereas here he says you need to know exactly how you became tamei. So how do we deal with this distinction? And Amar Rabbi Yeshua responds to Rabbi Eliezer by saying, Harei Omer, Oh Hoda Olav Chataso Asher Chataba. No, you need to know exactly how you sinned, or you don't bring the chatas. And so therefore, Rabbi Yeshua sounds like Rabbi Eliezer's position over here. So how do we deal with the contradiction between Rabbi Eliezer? So the Gemara says, Mishani, that after he raises contradiction within Rabbi Eliezer, he answered, Hasam asher chata vehevi amrachmana. Meaning to say, Chet kol shehu. Hachi milti chsiv bechol davar tamei, oben vela sheretz tamei. Lamoish ma'amina ve'inen ad yada ibe sheretz itma, even vela itma. So it's basically on the basis of the verses, because with respect to the sin offering by the kares, it says, Asher chata vevi, if he sinned, he brings it. Meaning to say, any sin, he doesn't need to know exactly which of the kares prohibitions. Whereas here it says, B'chol davar tamei, oben vela sheretz tamei. So the extra words sharetz is to teach us you have to know if you sin with a nevela or with a sharetz. Yes. No, a carbon chatas, the sin of tumas mikdash v'kadashiv is a carbon all of the orid. It's not a chatas. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva, who says you just need to know that you're tamei that you were tamei, and you don't need to know how exactly you became tamei. What does he do with the pasuk? Why does he, according to Rabbi Akiva, why does it say, b'chol davar tamei, omen nevelos sheretz tamei? Why does it say that? According to Rabbi Akiva, oben nevelos chaya tamei, oben nevelos be'ema tamei, oben nevelos sheretz tamei. Even now, ami menavu tamei v'ashem. It says, "Adi d'bayla meltav behema v'chaya." Look at the Rabbi. Since it needs to talk about a behema and chaya, like Rabbi said back on Zion Amid Aleph. Remember, Rabbi told us to teach us the drasha that Rabbi learned out from the fact that it says oben velos behema tameya, that it also applies the obligation of the carbon oil. The orid also applies to somebody who ate kodesh while they're in a state of tumah. So that's why you need that's why you need behema v'chaya. So therefore, so therefore, for that reason, it also says sheretz. And why? Why would it say sheretz? Like Rabbi Shmuel taught, anytime there's a passage in the Torah that's repeated, the only reason why it's repeated is because there's something new in it. But sometimes it repeats things in the Torah which are unnecessary. Rabbi Eliezer, Hi ba my avidla, right? So according to Rabbi Yeshua, remember Rabbi Yeshua says, you need to know exactly how you did the sin in order to bring the carbon chata. So you need to know what exactly the sin was. So what is in that Rabbi Yeshua learned that from the word ba? But what is Rabbi Eliezer who says either way you sin? What does he do with it? He says prato misasik. It means if you did the sin without even a little bit of awareness, you were just in the middle of, let's say, cutting vegetables, and you accidentally, or you're in the middle of eating vegetables, and accidentally this piece of food dropped in your mouth, which was kares, you had no idea that you were even doing anything. That you're not going to bring the sin offering. Rabbi Yochanan says, so going back to Chizkiah's answer, what was the difference between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva? Says the difference is if you need to know that it was a nevel or a sheretz. But Rabbi Yochanan says, no, there's no difference between them. Mashmos, Darshan, Ika Benayo. That the only difference between them is how they read the verses, but there's no real distinction between them. That's what he says. The Rav Sheshes, and so too, B'cheinam Rav Sheshes, Mashmos, Darshan, Ika Benayo. The Rav Sheshes, Machlef, the Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva, the Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Eliezer. The Rav Sheshes, when he used to teach us, he used to switch the positions. Rashi says, sometimes he would teach it as this is the words of Rabbi Akiva, sometimes the Rabbi Eliezer, and he wasn't precise because he says there's no distinction, there's no practical distinction between them. So, Rav Nachman, Helam Zev is Zev Biyado Mahu. Let's say he goes into the temple, according to both Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer, he's only liable for Tumas Kadashav, but not if he forgot he was he was tamei and he entered into the temple. But let's say if he forgot that this was the temple, then he's not going to be chayiv. So therefore, Gemara says, let's say helam zev zev yadom. Let's say he has both the forgetting that this is tamei and this is a temple. So according to Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva, who say you're exempt for going into the temple in a state, you don't bring the carbon oil of the yored al tumas mikdash for going to the temple without realizing it was a temple while you're tamei. Let's say you did both of them together, meaning to say you forgot that you were tamei and you were in the temple at the same time. So he said, what are you talking about? He's tamei and he went into the temple. Of course he has to bring a carbon. So the chayiv, the Gemara says, no, we should be exempt. Just the opposite, should be exempt. Because he went into the temple without realizing it was the temple. So he should be exempt. Amar Rashi chazinan, we have to look. Imi tuma kaparish, hariyalam tuma biado v'chayev. Imi mikdash kaparish, hariyalam mikdash biado upater. We have to see what causes him to jump and try and get out of there. Is it because somebody says, you're tamei, and he says, I'm tamei, and he runs out? Or if somebody says to him, this is the temple, and he hears it and then he runs out. If it was because he said he was tamei, it'd be liable. If it was because it was the mikdash, he'd be exempt. I know you're going to ask, so just wait a second. I don't know what you're going to ask, but it's a very strange thing. It's a very strange suggestion. So, was that what you're going to ask? The Ravina says, what are you talking about? The only reason why he's leaving the temple is because he's tamei. And the only reason why he's leaving because he's tamei is because he's in the mikdash. There's no distinction between them. And Rashi then says, since there's no distinction between them, upater, he's exempt. He could have said there's no distinction between them and he's liable. Rashi says there's no distinction between them and he's exempt. Rashi goes leniently.
One could be a case where you knew you were tuma, you knew you were tamei, and you forgot, and then you entered the temple and didn't know it was the temple, and you discovered the temple, and you found it. That's one situation. The other situation is you knew you were tamei, and you entered the building, but you had no idea it was the temple, and then when you discovered it was the temple, you knew it was the temple.
Say it again. What's the first one?
The first case is
right. Right.
You just didn't know you were in the temple.
That's Tumas Mikdash. So that if you knew your temple, you didn't know that this was the temple. That's Tumas Mikdash. So Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Eliezer say you're not liable in that situation because it's Tumas Mikdash. But we're talking about a case. The question here is, you didn't know you were tamei and you didn't know it's the Mikdash. And that's the case. And Rashi says that lo shna means you're exempt. So now we go down this path. That's a pun. Thank you. Shnei Shevilin. You'll see. It says two paths. I said now we're going down this path, and it's two paths. So let's say you have two paths, and there's a dead body buried on one of the paths. You just don't know which one. Echad tamei v'echad tar. One road is a person, there's a dead body there, and the other, there's no dead body. V'aloch barishon, and he walked down the first path, v'lo nichnas, and he doesn't enter into the temple. And then b'sheni, so he goes on the first path, and he doesn't know if he's tamei or tar, and he doesn't go into the temple. And then he goes down the second path, v'nichnas, and he now knows that he's walked on both paths, so he's for sure tamei. And then he enters the temple, forgetting that he's tamei. Then he's going to have to bring a carbon over yored, chayev. He has to bring the carbon over yored because he has knowledge at the outset. Before he had initial knowledge, and he went and he forgot, and he went to the temple. So he has to bring tumas mikdash. He has to bring for somebody who's tamei and enters into the temple. But halach barishon v'nichnas. Let's say he went down the first path and he went into the temple, but then he's not sure if he was tamei. He just thinks he might have been tamei. And then He's on, and then he got the ashes of the red heifer sprinkled on him. Vishina, and then after he gets the ashes of the red heifer sprinkled on him, what does he do? Vishana, he has the ashes, Vishana, and Vitavel. So he did everything again. He did the ashes on day 3 and day 7, immersed in the mikvah, and then he goes down the second bath and he goes in, then he's liable. Why is he liable under those cases? Because he certainly went in to the temple when he was tamei, either the first time he was tamei or the second time he was tamei. But even though he doesn't know for sure when he goes in the second time that he's tamei at this moment, for sure on one of those times he was tamei when he entered into the temple. So therefore, he's liable. Whereas Rabbi Shimon says he's pater. Why? Because Rabbi Shimon says neither time did he have a yediyah vadayas. He didn't know for sure each time that he was tamei, and he only had a suffix yediyah each time. And so therefore, Rabbi Shimon says you're pater. Rabbi Shimon Yehuda poter bekulan mishum Rabbi Shimon. He says Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda says all of them, even the first time where he knew for sure he was tamei when he went in. Rabbi Shimon Yehuda says, I adopt Rabbi Shimon's logic, and I'm going to say it's exempt even in that case. The Gemara is going to explain it. Bekulan, so asks the Gemara about Filo Bekamaisa on the top of 19b. Even in the first case, Mimanav Shach Tameyu. First case, either way, he's Tamei. He's Tamei either from the first time or from the second time, but he's for sure Tamei. So says the Gemara, Amarava Hachav Mayaskina and Kigun Shahach Barishon. Now we're talking about a scenario where he walked down the first path. That he forgot that he walked down the first path. So he still, before he entered in the temple, he didn't know for sure that he was tamei, because really, we know for sure he was tamei, but he doesn't know. He only knows a portion of it. He thinks he's only unsure if he's tamei because he forgot it. So he doesn't have a complete idea. We know he's tamei, but he needs to know he's tamei. And so therefore he's not going to be liable. This is the dispute. The Tanakama's other position that a partial yediyah is like total yediyah, and therefore, halach barishon v'nichnas, he's a v'shana v'tavo b'chazer halach b'sheni v'nichnas chayiv. Excuse me. Tanakama's other position, miktas yediyah, is like total yediyah, and so therefore he's going to be liable. Rabbi Shimon Sever, no, lo amrina miktas yediyah kachol yediyah. We don't say the partial yediyah is like the full yediyah. But the second case, where halach barishon v'nichnas, he's a v'shana v'tavo chazer halach b'sheni v'nichnas chayiv. Rabbi Shimon Pater. So the Gemara says, let's look at the second case, where he for sure was tummy at one of them, but he still has a partial yediyah, and according to Rabbi Shimon, he should be exempt there. Rabbi Shimon Pater, v'amai. So the Gemara says, v'amai chayiv. Why does, under those circumstances, the Gemara says, under those circumstances, we're going to say, why, according to the Tanakama, in this case, does the Tanakama say you are liable? The Tanakama says, in this case, you're liable, and Rabbi Shimon Pater. But according to Tanakama, why you're liable? It's still a suffix yediyah, because when you went down the second one, you're not sure if that's the reason why you're tamei. So it's like the case of the person who forgot. So I'm a Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, "Kan asu safek yediyah ki yediyah." Reish Lakish says a different answer. Reish Lakish says, "Amani Rabbi Shmuel namar lo ba'ina yediyah v'tchila." So Rabbi Yochanan's answer is that here in this case, where he has a suffix yediyah, in a case where we're going to consider in this case that a suffix yediyah is going to be like he had full knowledge. So it's considered to be like yediyah stachila. It's considered like an initial outset under this type of scenario. Not every suffix yediyah is considered like yediyah, Because what's the distinction? Then in the first case, he knows there's tumah. He just doesn't know if he became tameh from it, but he knows there's tumah. And so therefore, they said, in this case, he knows there's tumah. He just doesn't know if he became tameh from it. And so therefore, they made that like a knowledge. But in the case where he himself doesn't know if there was tumah, then we don't say Yedias Tumah is like Tumah. So if we know that there was Tumah there, he just doesn't know if he touched it, that's going to be considered like knowledge. But if he doesn't know if there's Tumah there at all, if he knows he doesn't know if there's Tumah there at all, we're going to say that's not Yediyah. Rish Lakish gives a different answer. He doesn't know which road he doesn't know which road he went on. So he doesn't know if there was Tumah on that road or not. Right.
That's the first case. He knows it's tumah, he just doesn't know that.
The first case, no, that's the first case, and the distinction is in the second case is he knows that the first case he doesn't know for sure each time if there's tumah there. The second case he knows for sure there was tumah there, he just doesn't know if he went on it.
So in the second case, he's not sure.
According to the Tanna Kama, it says he's chayev. Tanna Kama says he's chayev. No, in the first case, the Tanna Kama said back in the first case that he's right. The Tanna Kama says in the first case. Right, the Tanna Kama is saying he's chayev in both cases, whereas Rabbi Shimon Poter in the second case, where the Tanna Kama still says you're liable in that case. So, and Rabbi Yochanan says in the second case, Tanna Kama is saying even though it's a suffix yediyah, it's still yediyah. But why is he liable in the first case? Only because he had forgot. Remember, we had said Rabbi says because he forgot that he was tamei at all. Whereas Rish Lakish gives a different answer. He says the answer of the Tanna Kama in the Brisa is like Rabbi Shimon Damar Loba Ina Yediyah Betchilo. He says we don't require Yediyah at the outset, and in order to be Chayav Karbonol of the Yored, you don't need Yediyah. You don't need it, and so therefore, if he only has the Yediyah suffix, he's going to say you're liable. But Rabbi Shimon, who says you're Potter, he says you require Yediyah. So the Gemara says, well, now we have a question between Rabbi Yochanan's position and Rish Lakish's position. Rami, Rabbi Yochanan, ad Rabbi Yochanan, Rish Lakish, ad Rish Lakish. So, in Italian, what does the Brisa say? Let's say you ate accidentally a piece of meat, and you're not sure if it was kosher or not, if it was chaylev, because he thought it was kosher. Vinoda, and then he finds out that it was a question. Then he has to bring what's called an asham taloi, a doubtful sin offering. But before he brings it, he again eats this meat, suffix chaylev, vinoda, and again he finds out about it. Rabbi Omer kashem shemevi chatas akol echad ve'echad. Rabbi says just like he brings a sin offering in that case for every eating by itself, kach meni asham taloi akol echad ve'echad. So too we bring two asham talois. Whereas Rabbi Shimon, Yehuda, Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Shimon, Eino maybe el asham taloi echad. You only bring one carbon asham taloi. Al shegato asher chagag Torah ribta shigot arbe v'asham taloi echad. The Torah says you bring many chatas, but only one asham taloi because it's based upon the pasuk. So Amar Rish Lakish, and Rish Lakish explains what's the position of Rabbi that you bring two asham talois. Kan shana Rabbi yediyos feikos milchalkos lechatos. That Rabbi's other position that even though you have a suffix yediyah, you bring many different chataos, and so therefore, in the case where there's a suffix, you would bring multiple asham talois, and so therefore, the Rabbi Yochanan says, "Kishem she'edios vaday ba'alma mischal kol lechatos Can you deal safos mitchal kol hashamos? But Rabbi Yochanan gives the position that just like chatos has different, if you have different yedios by a chatos, you bring different sin offerings, also by a asham. So anyway, this is a contradiction. Both Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shlokish are admitting here that he has to bring two hashamos because of the idea of suffix, and they're disputed by the chatas. That do we say that the idea of suffix between each sin is enough to make you bring two chatos? Now this is a problem because earlier Rabbi Yochanan said Yediyah Safek is considered a Yediyah, and Rabbi Shlokish says it's not. And here we see the opposite. Rabbi Shlokish is saying Yediyah Safek is considered Yediyah, Rabbi Yochanan says it's not. So Bishlam and the Rabbi Yochanan lo kasha. Because he says by Yediyah Tchila Kan Asu, lo b'kol Torah Kol Asu. By Tumas Mikdash V'Kadashav, we consider that Yediyah Safek a Yediyah, but not in the rest of the Torah. And what's the reason? Because here, with respect to carbon all the yored, it doesn't say that you need a yediyah, because it says mi v'ne'alam hudika asi. Called Torah kua also. So here it's learned out only if there was a yediyah that he forgot is he liable, and so therefore yediyah safek is also sufficient. Whereas in the rest of the Torah, it dechsev ohodolav yediyah mal yasabinan. So that's for Rabbi Yochanan saying by carbon over yored yediyah safek is sufficient to make you liable. Our Reish Lakish adamukim like Rabbi Shmuel nukim like Rabbi. Why does Reish Lakish have to say that this brayso is like Rabbi Shmuel who doesn't require yediyah b'tchila? Why doesn't he say that the Tanakama holds like Rabbi? And yediyah safek is considered a yediyah, and therefore you're liable. Mashmalan, no, Al-Kamashman, Reish Lakish is giving this answer. He's telling us like Reish Lakish, Rabbi Shmuel, to tell us Rabbi Shmuel will buy Yediyah B'tchila. Rabbi Shmuel does not require Yediyah at the outset. He wants to teach us that Chiddush. Pshita do buy. It obviously doesn't require it. I mean, the one we actually cry. Remember we learned earlier that he ran out of psukim. He ran out of anelam. Even now I'm the mechayev al mikdash, because he says you're liable for not realizing this was the temple. So of course he doesn't have an extra pasuk to tell us yediyah safek. And so obviously the case Rabbi Shmuel does not require yediyah at the beginning. Gemara says no. Ma'al detema kilei slei mikra avagmar slei. You might have said Rabbi Shmuel doesn't have a verse to tell us yediyah b'tchila for Rabbi Shmuel. But he might have had a tradition. Kamashon, we don't say that. But let's start the next Mishnah. And it says the next Mishnah, we finally get to Shevuos. We finally get to oaths. And we repeat what we said at the beginning of our tractate. Shevuos Shtayim Shein Arba. There are oaths that are two that are four. What is that case? Shevuos She'ochal v'Shevuos She'ochal. You take it's called a Shevuos Bitoy. That this is La Rao Eitev. This is about the future. You say, I'm going to do something or I'm not going to do something. These are two, and there are also four. Shelo ochel or shachalti. If you take an oath, shachalti v'shelo ochalti, you take an oath that I ate and I didn't eat. So let's say shvuah shelo ochel v'achal. If you take an oath that I will not eat and you eat kosher, if you eat any amount, you're chayav, you're liable, even for a mashu, even for any amount. That's the position of Rabbi Akiva. Amar lo Rabbi Akiva, where else do we have a scenario where if you eat any amount, you're liable? Now you're going to be liable if you just eat any amount. Amar Rabbi Akiva, maybe carbon. Where else do we see a scenario where you just said something and you have to bring a carbon because you didn't keep it? So since it's because he didn't keep his word, also there's mashu that if you say I'm not going to eat, he has in mind to even prohibit himself even a kosher. And so therefore, Shazem Adavra may be carbon. So therefore, we see that this person speaks and he brings a carbon, and if he violates even a mashu, he has, by eating even a small drop, he has to bring a carbon. Okay, so we'll stop here. It's today's daf. A big shikoyach.